They told us Bernard was trying to save the silo. But what if that was never his real job? What if Bernard isn't trying to prevent the ending? He's trying to make sure it happens exactly the way it always has. Because the biggest secret in Silo isn't hidden beneath the ground. It isn't inside the vault. It isn't even locked away in forgotten files. The real secret is that Bernard already knows how this story ends. And once he noticed the clues, every decision he makes becomes terrifying. Every warning, every lie, every execution, every silence. They all point toward one possibility. Bernard isn't reacting to events. He's following a script. And this changes everything we thought we knew about Season 3. Because if Bernard already knows the ending, then Juliet was never escaping. She was always walking toward a destination someone predicted long before she was born. But here's what changes everything. The show has never treated Bernard like an ordinary leader. It treats him like a man carrying information that nobody else is allowed to see. That difference matters. Because throughout the series, Bernard almost never panics.
People panic.
Sheriffs panic. Citizens panic. Judicial officers panic. Even powerful people make emotional mistakes. Bernard rarely does. Instead, he watches.
He waits.
Then, he makes one move at exactly the right moment. That's not normal leadership. That's someone acting on knowledge other people don't have. And this is where it gets darker. Most viewers assume Bernard is simply protecting the silo from chaos. But look at what the show is actually telling us. Whenever someone discovers an important truth, Bernard is already prepared, not surprised.
Prepared.
That tiny difference changes his entire character. Think about Juliet. Every discovery she makes feels new to her. Every hidden tunnel. Every forbidden question. Every secret message. She believes she's uncovering history. But Bernard behaves like someone who's seen this exact chain of events before. Almost like he's waiting for certain pieces to fall into place.
Why?
Because the real mystery isn't whether Bernard knows secrets.
Of course he knows secrets.
The real mystery is why he never seems shocked when those secrets begin leaking out. This is the detail everyone missed. Knowledge alone doesn't explain Bernard's calmness. Prediction does. Imagine reading the final chapter of a novel before everyone else. You wouldn't panic every time a character made a dangerous choice. Because you already know where the story ends. Now, imagine living inside that novel. That's Bernard. Every crisis looks different to everyone else. To Bernard, it's another page turning exactly when expected. At first, this sounds impossible. How could anyone know the future? The answer may not be time travel. It may be repetition. Because Silo has quietly hinted at something terrifying from the very beginning. History doesn't repeat accidentally. It repeats by design. Look carefully at the rules inside the silo. They aren't ordinary laws. They're rituals. Every generation follows them. Every generation believes they're necessary. Every generation inherits fear without understanding where it came from. That's exactly how cycles survive. Not through force. Through memory. Or, even worse, through edited memory. And Bernard sits at the center of that system. He's more than an administrator. He's the guardian of a pattern that may have repeated dozens, or even hundreds, of times. Think about how often characters believe they're making free choices. George chose to investigate. Allison chose to question reality. Holston chose to leave. Juliet chose to keep digging. Different people, different personalities, different motivations. Yet somehow, they all arrive at almost the same destination. That can't be coincidence forever. At some point, coincidence becomes design. And Bernard seems to understand that design better than anyone alive. But here's something even stranger. Notice what Bernard almost never tries to destroy. Information. Instead, he controls who receives it. That's an important distinction. If knowledge itself were dangerous, he'd erase every trace of it. Instead, certain files survive. Certain relics survive. Certain clues survive just long enough for the right person to find them.
Why?
Unless they're supposed to. Unless every generation needs someone to rediscover the truth. Not enough to break the system. Just enough to keep the cycle moving. Look at what the show is actually telling us. Whenever one mystery is solved, Another appears. Almost like invisible hands are guiding curious people down a carefully planned path. That's not the real mystery. The real mystery is who built the path. And why Bernard never seems interested in stopping people from entering it. Instead, he simply makes sure they never reach the end before they're supposed to. That's exactly how someone behaves when protecting a process. Not hiding a secret, protecting a sequence. And suddenly, Bernard's cold personality starts making horrifying sense. He's not emotionless because he lacks empathy. He's emotionless because he's carrying the unbearable weight of knowing where every decision eventually leads. Imagine watching history repeat again, and again, and again. Watching new heroes believe they're changing the world, only to discover they're stepping into footprints left decades earlier. Eventually, hope itself would become predictable. Eventually, rebellion would look ordinary. Eventually, you would stop reacting. You would simply wait. And that may be exactly what Bernard has been doing all along. Waiting for the next Juliet. Waiting for the next person destined to challenge the silo. Waiting, because he already knows what comes after. But if that's true, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. Who taught Bernard how this story ends in the first place? Who taught Bernard the ending? At first, the obvious answer seems to be IT. After all, IT controls the servers, the records, the surveillance, and the information that shapes life inside the silo. Bernard inherited that position, so naturally he inherited its secrets. But here's what changes everything. The information Bernard receives doesn't feel like ordinary history. It feels like instructions. There's a huge difference. History tells you what happened. Instructions tell you what must happen next. And that difference could explain almost every decision Bernard has made. Think about every time Bernard talks about protecting the order. Most people hear that phrase and assume it's just another book of rules. But what if the order isn't really a law book at all? What if it's a prediction manual? A guide written by the founders after watching this exact chain of events happen over and over again. That would completely change the meaning of Bernard's role. He's not making decisions. He's checking boxes. He's making sure each event arrives exactly when it should. And this is where it gets darker. The order never seems interested in preventing rebellion. Instead, it prepares for rebellion. Ask yourself why. If your goal is absolute control, you eliminate resistance before it begins. Yet the founders apparently expected certain people to question everything. Why would they plan for that? Unless questioning the system was always part of the system. This is the detail everyone missed. The silo doesn't simply create obedient citizens. It also creates predictable rebels. Think about Allison. She begins asking dangerous questions. She notices small inconsistencies. She refuses to ignore evidence. Eventually, she reaches a conclusion that changes everything. Now think about George. His curiosity follows the same pattern. Different clues. Same destination. Then comes Juliet. Again, the pattern repeats. Different personality. Different skills. Exactly the same unstoppable curiosity. Look at what the show is actually telling us. These aren't random people. They're products of the same environment. The silo creates pressure. Pressure creates doubt. Doubt creates investigation. Investigation creates conflict. Conflict creates another reset. The cycle starts again. Bernard understands that cycle better than anyone. That's why he rarely tries to stop curiosity during its earliest stages. He watches it grow, because he already knows where it leads. Almost like someone watching dominoes fall after placing every piece. But here's another clue that's even more disturbing. Notice Bernard's conversations with Lukas. Most viewers focused on Bernard testing Lukas' intelligence. But there may have been something much deeper happening. Bernard wasn't simply choosing a replacement. He was preparing the next keeper of the cycle. Every question Bernard asks feels deliberate. Not because he's searching for answers. Because he's searching for someone capable of carrying forbidden knowledge without immediately destroying the system. That's an incredibly specific requirement. You don't need that kind of successor unless you expect history to continue repeating. And suddenly Lukas becomes far more important than we realized. He's intelligent, curious, patient. He loves discovering hidden patterns. Those aren't random character traits. Those are exactly the qualities Bernard himself possesses. It's almost as if Bernard sees his younger self standing in front of him, someone who will eventually understand why impossible choices become necessary. And this is where the emotional tragedy begins. What if every head of IT starts as an idealist? Imagine a young Bernard years ago, curious, hopeful, convinced he could fix everything. Then imagine someone handing him the order, showing him centuries of identical rebellions, identical heroes, identical failures, identical endings. How long would it take before hope turned into acceptance? Not because the system defeated him, because the evidence did. Imagine reading report after report explaining that every attempt to change the silo ended the same way. Every revolution, every reform, every escape attempt, every brilliant mind, eventually reaching the exact same conclusion. At some point, wouldn't even the smartest person begin believing the ending cannot be changed? That's not obedience. That's psychological surrender. And Bernard behaves exactly like someone who surrendered years ago. Not to another person, to inevitability itself. That explains something many fans have struggled to understand. Why does Bernard sometimes look genuinely sad after making ruthless decisions? If he were simply evil, there would be satisfaction. Instead, we often see exhaustion, regret, silence. Almost like he's performing duties he wishes no longer existed. Because perhaps he already knows the cost of every decision before making it. Imagine having to sacrifice one person today because the order claims it prevents thousands of deaths tomorrow. Would you hesitate? Of course. Would you still do it if every historical record proved the alternative ended in catastrophe? That's the impossible position Bernard may be trapped inside. He's no longer choosing between good and evil. He's choosing between terrible and worse. But here's the terrifying possibility. What if the order itself is lying? What if Bernard has spent years obeying predictions that were never true? That possibility changes everything. Because suddenly Bernard isn't protecting humanity. He's protecting an illusion created centuries earlier. Look at what the show is actually telling us. Almost everything Bernard knows comes from inherited information. Very little comes from personal experience outside the silo. He trusts the founders. He trusts the records. He trusts the order. But what if those records were edited? What if every generation only receives the version of history the founders wanted them to believe? Then Bernard isn't the mastermind. He's another prisoner, just locked inside a much larger cage. A prison made of information instead of steel. And that's far more dangerous. Because physical prisons can be escaped. Mental prisons become invisible. The person trapped inside doesn't even realize the walls exist. Bernard may believe he's preserving civilization, when in reality, he could be preserving someone else's experiment. But if Bernard is following a script written by people long dead, then the biggest question isn't whether Juliet can escape the silo. It's whether anyone can escape the story the founders already wrote. But what if we've been asking the wrong question all along? For years, fans have wondered whether Juliet will destroy the system, whether she will expose the truth, whether she will finally break the cycle that trapped generations inside the silo. But that's not the real mystery. The real mystery is whether Bernard has been waiting for her to try. Because if our theory is correct, then Juliet isn't an unexpected threat. She's the final piece of a pattern Bernard has watched unfold before. And this is where it gets darker. Think about the way the silo operates. Every rule seems designed to stop people from asking questions. But strangely, the rules never eliminate curiosity completely. They only slow it down.
Why?
Because total control would erase the very people the system seems to expect. Every generation produces someone different. Someone who refuses to accept easy answers. Someone who notices tiny inconsistencies everyone else ignores. Someone willing to risk everything for the truth. This time, that person is Juliet. Before her, it was George. Before George, Allison. And before Allison, how many others were there? The show has quietly suggested that the silo has existed for generations. That means this pattern could have repeated dozens of times. Maybe even hundreds. Every generation believes they are witnessing history, when in reality, they are replaying it. Look at what the show is actually telling us. The founders didn't just build a shelter.
They built a machine.
Not a machine powered by gears or electricity. A machine powered by human behavior.
Fear.
Hope. Curiosity.
Loss.
Rebellion. Every emotion becomes another moving part. Every citizen unknowingly keeps the machine alive. Bernard understands this. That's why he rarely behaves like a dictator desperate to stay in power. Instead, he behaves like a caretaker protecting something much older than himself. Power isn't his reward. It's his burden. And maybe that's why he always seems tired. Not physically. Mentally. Like someone carrying a secret that no human was ever supposed to carry. Imagine discovering that your entire civilization survives only because every generation repeats the same tragedy. Would you tell everyone? Or would you stay silent? Bernard chose silence. Not because silence is easier. Because he believes the truth is even more dangerous. But here's the detail everyone missed. Bernard never truly fights Juliet's intelligence. He fights her timing. Think back to the moments when Juliet gets close to answers. Bernard intervenes just enough to delay her. Not always enough to stop her. Just enough to control when the next revelation happens. That isn't random. It's rhythm. Almost like a conductor making sure every instrument enters at exactly the right moment. Because if one event happens too early, the entire sequence could collapse. And if that's true, Bernard isn't protecting secrets. He's protecting order. Not the order written in the book. The order of events themselves. That changes his entire character. He doesn't see himself as the villain. He sees himself as the last person holding reality together. Whether he's right or horribly wrong is another question entirely. And that question could define all of Season 3. Now think about Lukas one more time. Why spend so much time preparing him? Why trust him with forbidden knowledge? Why allow him to see things ordinary citizens never will? Because Bernard knows he won't be there forever. The cycle demands another keeper, another guardian, another person forced to make impossible choices. And here's the cruel irony. Lukas may believe he's learning how to save the silo, when in reality, he may be learning how to become the next Bernard. The next man convinced there is only one possible ending. That possibility is terrifying, because it means the system doesn't just preserve itself. It replaces anyone who questions it with someone who eventually defends it. The rebellion doesn't destroy the machine. The machine absorbs the rebellion. Every hero eventually becomes another protector of the cycle, unless someone refuses the role. And that's exactly why Juliet matters. Not because she's smarter than everyone else. Not because she's stronger. But because she consistently does something Bernard stopped doing years ago. She refuses to accept inevitability. Every impossible door becomes another challenge. Every lie becomes another reason to dig deeper. Every warning becomes proof that someone is hiding something worth finding. Bernard believes history cannot change. Juliet believes history hasn't been fully understood. Those are two completely different ways of seeing the world. And only one of them can be right. But here's the final twist. What if Bernard isn't wrong? What if every attempt to escape really has ended in disaster? What if every previous Juliet failed? What if the founders documented every outcome because they had already watched humanity repeat the same mistakes again and again? Then Bernard isn't protecting a lie. He's protecting the only future that has ever worked. But if that's true, why does the show keep placing tiny cracks in Bernard's certainty? Why does he hesitate? Why does he sometimes look at Juliet with something that almost resembles hope? Hope is a dangerous emotion for someone who believes the ending is already written. Unless a part of Bernard wants to be proven wrong. A part of him wants someone to accomplish what no one before ever could. Maybe every cold decision, every impossible sacrifice, every painful compromise has been leading to one final test. Not of the silo, not of Juliet, but of the story itself. Can destiny actually be rewritten? Or has Bernard already read the final page and simply doesn't realize this time someone has changed the ending? Because if Season 3 answers that question, it won't just reveal the future of Juliet. It will reveal whether the greatest prison in Silo was ever made of concrete and steel, or whether it was always the belief that the future could never change.